Bordeaux. Gosh, for many, it's the beginning and perhaps slightly sadly, the end of their fine wine appreciation. It's certainly a region which unquestionably continues to captivate people's attention and also their share of wallet as well. I think, Bordeaux is much loved, and for good reason, particularly the reds. And we're going to start with a couple of whites, but I think Bordeaux's influence on the fine wine world cannot be overstated. Sorry, cannot be overstated. In the sense that if you want to be known as a great Napa Cabernet, if you want to be known as a great Australian Barossa Shiraz Cabernet Shiraz, if you want to be known as, look at the fact that the Chilean wines that are coming of age at the moment refer to themselves as the Chilean first growths, we still view the world of fine wine, Cabernet and Merlot based wines at least, through the lens of Bordeaux. Now, whether that's right or wrong is, a matter for debate, but the influence of Bordeaux on the fine wine world is second to none. We love Burgundy, we love Barolo, we love the wines of Spain, but when it comes to the power of Bordeaux, nothing can rival it. And there are quite a few reasons for that, which we'll, unpack a little bit as we go along. Certainly, we've got an interesting lineup this evening. We've tried to mix it up a bit in terms of vintages. We've called it past and present. Truth be told, I mean, we're starting with the Carbonnieux 17, but most of these wines are, I would say, past or, beginning to hit their middle-age stride, shall we say. It's nice to be able to do a tasting with wines with this impressive degree of maturity. And we'll launch off with the Carbonnieux. So everyone give it a good whirl and get a good sniff. When we think of Bordeaux, let's be entirely honest, I'd be very surprised if anyone here on this call or anyone anywhere didn't immediately leap to red wines. White wine is not the wine we think of when we think of Bordeaux. And yet, and I have this in my notes from years ago, so I can only assume it's true. I wouldn't have made it up at the time, although to be entirely fair, I've yet to re-find the statistics on which I base this. But Bordeaux is the second biggest producer of Sauvignon Blanc in the world, after the Loire Valley. And now I would be delighted to either be proven wrong so I can stop trotting this fact out that isn't a fact, or someone could dig it up somewhere and allow me to continue mentioning this, because I think it's an interesting thing to point out. Bordeaux is such a big region and we place so much emphasis on the dry reds that we don't necessarily consider the whites. And yet, white Bordeaux was very significant here in the UK for many, many years, before Burgundy was widely consumed. Bordeaux was very largely enjoyed in the UK. And Sauternes, Meg, yes, Sauternes. So sweet wines of Bordeaux, which we don't have tonight, which is probably a bit of a shame now I think about it. But I thought it was more interesting for the purposes of this tasting to do a comparison of, an exact sort of 10-year leap between dry whites. Where was I? Oh yeah, no, so Bordeaux whites. Oh, hang on, I'm just gonna let Ed in here. Bordeaux whites might seem a little bit of an afterthought to some, but actually are really quite important. They've lost some of their market share over the years, but back in the day, and by back in the day, I mean right up until the very early 90s, Bordeaux whites were drunk, or at least seen in the UK a lot more commonly. And that's because of the lack of alternatives, to be perfectly blunt. They were perfectly nice white Bordeauxs, but 1991 was a bad vintage. It was one of the last bad vintages in Bordeaux. I think after that, you have to go all the way up to 2013 to find another vintage which was actively disagreeable. And the problem was that even us Brits were not prepared to tolerate 1991 white Bordeaux. And it just so happened at that stage that the very clever, very forward-looking Australian winemakers started a big push on Aussie Chardonnay, which started flooding the market in a big way in the very early 90s. And it had fruit, it was ripe, it had lots of nice custardy, creamy, caramelly, fudgy, toffee tone new oak. And it was a world apart from this lean, green, strippy, underripe Sauvignon Blanc based white from Bordeaux. And I think Bordeaux whites have never really recovered. However, I would commend you very, very heartily to really get behind white Bordeaux. You don't need a lot of it in your cellar, but it's good, it's nice, and with a little bit of age, not too much, it becomes really quite interesting and really quite exciting. So Raj, I think I just saw a message from you flash up saying that you have ended up with 2 of the Dôme and not the Fellaini Cigar. Well, you've done quite well there in the sense that the Dôme's at least double the price, but obviously that's a bit disappointing in terms of being able to do the comparison that is coming up. So apologies for that. We'll have to work out how to compensate you for the missing vial. Sorry about that. Carbonnieux, everyone's got it, everyone's trying it, everyone's tasting it. 55% Sauvignon Blanc, 45% Semillon. 2017 was the year of the frosts in Bordeaux. I mean, really devastating frosts for a lot of the region. Generally speaking, though, so I'm just going to let Claire in here. Generally speaking, though, it was only very specific vineyard areas which were badly hit by frost, and it tended to be, unfortunately, those in the least well-positioned sites. So although frost was the defining meteorological factor in the vintage, it was far less significant for the majority of vineyards in good positions than it was for a lot of the more poorly situated sites. I do remember being in Bordeaux in the summer of 2017 and seeing the devastation that these frosts had wrought on the vineyards in places like the plain of Saint-Emilion. So these lower, much more clay-based vineyards right down by the roads. There were no grapes on the vines. There were these brown, dead vineyards. It was quite distressing, to be perfectly honest. But glad to say that the frost did not affect a lot of the more fortunately situated, better situated vineyards on both sides of the Gironde. Carbonnieux is one of the oldest, if not the best known, it's not one of the better known, but it's one of the oldest chateaux in Bordeaux, dates back to the 12th century. And it's pretty well situated. It's a bit of an under the radar gem. I tend to buy a bit of Carbonnieux myself because it's great value, whether you buy it en primeur or later on. It's always pretty good value, and it's got some pretty illustrious neighbors. It's very close to Smith Haute Lafitte, which obviously makes fantastic reds and also tremendous whites. It's definitely in the top 3 producers of white wine in Bordeaux, Smith Haute Lafitte. And you're also near Haute Bailly as well, another great Pessac producer. It's been owned by the Perrin family, who made a sterling effort to renovate the cellars in the early 90s. And it's a pretty big vineyard. I mean, there's a big old expanse here on which they plant both red and white grapes. And what's quite interesting is that the vineyard has areas which are more gravel dominant soils, which are good for the Cabernet Sauvignon, and that tends to be where they plant the reds. And then these slightly cooler areas, these slightly warmer areas, these slightly cooler areas, these slightly damper areas with more clay and limestone based soils, which is where they plant the white wines, the white grapes. Yeah, so we're 55% Sauvignon Blanc, 45% Semillon. And right now, I would say, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm getting an almost even character of both grapes. Definitely some of that Sauvignon green character, that gooseberry character, the hay character, some of the cliched aromas we associate with Sauvignon are definitely there. But underlying that, there's slightly deeper toned fruit, more of the yellow plums, more of the orchard fruit character, apricot lychee raj. Yeah, love it. Yeah, but there's like a twist of white pepper as well. It's and this is the Semillon just beginning after 3 years to start making its presence felt. With white Bordeaux, you tend to notice that in its early years, the Sauvignon, irrespective of the percentage in the blend, the Sauvignon tends to be the dominant variety on the nose and on the palate. And as the wine ages, the Semillon tends to push through. And I think now this wine is at the beginning of its drinking window. It's really rather lovely now, I have to say, on its fruit. But you're beginning to get a touch more of the complexity from the Semillon just starting to poke through. Any comments on this? I'm dying to know, how much white Bordeaux we as the assembled group drink, whether we like it generally, whether we've never tried it before. Any thoughts here? Okay, we're being quiet so far this evening. That's fine. After a few more glasses, Nathan, you love
I'll jump in. I'll jump in, Tom. And I'm always a big white wine drinker. As much as I love red Bordeaux, I think there's something quite special about white Bordeaux, and particularly Grave and Pessac-Léognan, that area.
Yeah, it's certainly the heartland of white Bordeaux production is down here in the south of the left bank, down here in Pessac and Grave. You do get some interesting whites from a number of producers. For example, Lynch-Barge in Pauillac further north makes quite an interesting white. Jonathan Maltus, two of whose wines we'll be trying this evening, makes a fabulous white in Saint-Emilion. Although I do think the white wines on the right bank tend to be of a very particular style. So the majority of the quality production is on the left bank, and as Nathan points out, it's this particular area, the Grave region, the Pessac-Léognan, where you tend to find the dominance of the quality whites, in fact. Yeah.
That wasn't me meowing, by the way.
Oh, you can hear that. That's our neighbour's cat, who I've left the window ever so slightly ajar just to give me some air here, so I can keep the door shut of my office without hearing the kids in the background. I've either got cats or children. It's a toss up of who's the noisiest. So anyway, apologies for that. One thing I suppose I'll try and do as we go, rather than doing a great big exposition on the history of Bordeaux, which could take hours, is unpack a little bit about the history of Bordeaux as we go. I haven't immediately led off with a massive introduction to the region and the history, because I think that's probably better served when we move on to the reds. Question from Steve there: are Grave and Pessac the same? Grave is the umbrella region. It's the bigger region in the south of the Médoc, below the Médoc, and Pessac is a sub-region within it, where you tend to get the best reds. Grave, beyond that, also has great reds, but it's the region which we most associate with white wines in Bordeaux. Julia's saying a little too much Sauvignon for her. Give it 5 years, Julia. Give it 5 years, and you'll see that the fairly hefty 45% worth of Semillon will begin to make its presence felt. It will soften the acidity. You'll get a touch of almost like banana, which isn't necessarily always an attractive thing, but in the case of white Bordeaux, it is, because it mollifies the acidity. You've got a richer character, richer palate. It's really rather attractive. And in fact, on that note, why don't we move on to the Dubourdieu Clos Floridian, which is exactly 10 years older. Okay. Sorry, I think someone unmuted themselves. I wasn't sure if was there a comment there that I might have missed. Apologies if so. Do speak up.
Do you tend to enjoy these white Bordeaux with food as well?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. They're very, very digestible. They're very versatile. I think they're also entirely underrated and overlooked. If you go to a nice restaurant, I won't say I often find myself, in fact, these days, of course, not at all, for the best part of a year, frankly, but back in those days when I remember what a restaurant looked like, you know, if you flick over to the white Bordeaux section, it tends to be pretty brief, and there will be wines on there with a little bit of age, and they are very, very versatile. This Sauvignon Semillon combo makes them very much middle of the road, in the sense that they're neither too spiky for the people who don't like Sauvignon drinkers, nor are they too rich for people who wouldn't necessarily have 100% Semillon on their own. And yeah, they work very nicely with a whole range of different foods. If we try now the 2007 Clove Floridian, I mean, look at that color as well. I mean, here, Julia in particular, this, you'd hardly recognize that this is at least 50% Sauvignon Blanc. You know, now is that Semillon, that sort of toffee character, almost like old Chenin, in fact, but definitely, you know, burnished, rich, really rather exotic, dried pineapple nose, lots of toasted hazelnuts. It's not Burgundian because it doesn't have an intrinsic Chardonnay character, but you know, it's moving into that really good old French white sort of arena. Wow, still perhaps the Sauvignon backbone just comes through on the finish there. You know, you've still got that freshness, giving it some power and some life. I love the salinity, the sapidity on the finish there. It's got great energy, far more on the palate than I think you imagine from the nose. I think you smell the nose and you think, gosh, that's quite gloopy, that's quite rich, a lot of toffee. But on the palate, really good nervosity, still great structure. And you know, this is a pretty modest wine. Even now, the few bottles we have left, I think, are hanging around the sort of 30-35 pound a bottle all in price. So I do think it's worth giving white Bordeaux a chance, because it can be really interesting and good value for sure. And this little bit of extra age just changes the complexity and the complexion quite considerably. So what do we think of this? We've got a 10-year spread of white Bordeaux. That's pretty unusual in a tasting. What do people think? Any big preferences for the 17 Carbonnieux or this?
I think for me, I'd go with the Carbonnieux.
You prefer the freshness of the Carbonnieux, David? Yep. Anyone agree or disagree, or just want to comment generally on the two?
I as well. I prefer the freshness of the Carbonnieux. This almost starts to smell a little bit like a dessert wine, almost like a white port.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Actually, that's an interesting one, because we're not. It doesn't smell like a Sauterne yet, although we're getting in that direction. But yeah, a white port, I can get that. I can totally get that. Yeah.
Tom, can you keep a white Bordeaux in the same way you can a white Burgundy? Would it eventually go downhill and then sort of come back as a big buttery wine, or does that just not happen?
It's a really interesting question, David. From personal experience, I have tried some unusually old white Bordeaux's back to the 20s. And I've been pretty amazed by how they have maintained their structure and their acidity and their, if not freshness, but a degree of vivacity. So I think the best terroirs, the best chateaux in the best vintages do have considerable potential for aging in the same way as great Burgundy. You've got to remember that Sauvignon Blanc naturally has higher acidity, and it's the acidity which is the pulse of life. It's the heartbeat of this wine, and that should allow it to age pretty well. As a rule of thumb, for me with white Bordeaux, I tend to treat them a little bit like Northern Rhone whites. Condrieu I love. Condrieu can be very, well, it's expensive, and in its youth, it can be a little monolithic, perhaps two-dimensional at best. And if you leave it for too long, the acidity drops and it becomes rather flabby and too much like eating a bar of carbolic soap. So the perfect time to get the wine is in its middle age, when it's sort of maybe 7 to 15 years old. And I tend to say the same in my experience with white Bordeaux. Leave it longer than you need to, but enjoy it before you have to. Yeah.
It's worth mentioning, Tom, the whites of the dry whites of Barsac and Sauterne now, given that they find it impossible to sell all their sweet wines. There are a lot of white wines coming out of that region as well now.
Right.
White wines.
Yeah. What I find quite interesting, even in the relatively brief time in which I've had the Clove Floridian in the glass, it's changed quite dramatically. There's a lot more herbal element coming out. The sort of sweetness on the nose has receded, and there's more, chamomile, Thai basil, really quite interesting aromas developing. It's a fascinating wine. It's a modest wine, but a fascinating one. I should tell you just briefly before we move on to the reds, it's in Pujols-sur-Siron in the Grave region. Siron's actually is also where our dear friends Château Trebiac are. One of our most popular Bordeaux red and white is based here in the same sort of plateau. And it was purchased by Denis and Florence Dubourdieu in 82. And the name, and I'm sure the sort of the crossword clue enthusiasts amongst you will have already picked this up. It's actually a composite of their names, Florence and Denis. It's Floridene. So that's where the name comes from. Yeah. And I think it's pretty good. I have to say, I think it's pretty good. So any more comments or questions on this before we move on to the meat of the matter, onto the reds? No, in that case, good. We shall move on. Right. 2015 Lafon Roche. Okay. So I'm having a slight issue with my test tube here. I might have to open this with my teeth. This is very ungamey. I'll do it off camera. In fact, mine resolutely does not want to open. This is going to take some dramatic measures here. We could well end up seeing me hurtle Bordeaux all over my nice white T-shirt here, which will make Teresa very cross. But Nathan, do you mind holding the audience whilst I just go and do my best to get this cap open?
I have to say, I think it's great that Tom managed to miss the gym between lockdowns so much so. I mean, can you imagine the humiliation for a wine guy not to be able to open a bottle of wine? I mean, I have to say that really is, absolutely is the pits, the absolute pits. So he's obviously gone off to try and find a way of doing it, and back we are. So we're going to
Perfect.
get
There you go.
hopefully now. There you are.
It required very little work. Just
I said lots of nice things about you, Tom.
I definitely, I'm sure. I'm absolutely sure. Okay, good. Gosh, that all went in. That was meant to be a half glass, but okay. Well, there we go. Lafon-Rochet is a vineyard which I tend to follow most years. I've enjoyed it. I think I've got vintages back to certainly 2005 in my cellar, and I've definitely got a case or two of the 09. I think it's a proper overperformer for Bordeaux. Now we're moving on to reds. Let's talk a little bit more about Bordeaux, the region, and the sort of fixation that the world has with it. Bordeaux was a swamp. Bordeaux was a swamp for most of right up until the sort of 1700s, when it was drained by the Dutch. And it's not like Burgundy, where you had all the Cistercian monks knocking around, experimenting with vines and grapes and terroirs, because sexual frustration drew them to nothing other than expressing themselves with another vice, which was alcohol. Bordeaux was there was nothing there of interest for the majority of its time. And then the Dutch drained the swamp, and what was really uncovered was these very interesting gravel banks on the left bank of the Gironde River. It's a major trading portal, and still, well, actually is less so, but certainly, Bordeaux was a major trading station. And these gravel banks, which went down to the river, there were these sort of 5 fingers as we sort of think of them. And the one in the furthest north was Saint-Estèphe. So if we look at the left bank of Bordeaux, we have Saint-Estèphe in the far north, and then that adjoins to Pauillac. And then beneath Pauillac, we have Saint-Julien. And under Saint-Julien, we have Margaux. This is the commune of Margaux rather than the Chateau of Margaux, which is the most famous chateau in the appellation. And beneath that, and beneath the city of Bordeaux itself, we have the Grave region, within which we have Pessac-Léognan. So this is the left bank of Bordeaux. I'm not going to show you a map because I just don't want to, frankly. And I will send you a map if you need to see a map of Bordeaux. But trust me, north to south, it's as explained. And you've got the Gironde River to the side. And up in the north, and this is really important when we consider this particular Château Lafon-Rochet, the density of the gravel underneath the topsoil is a little bit less. Why is this important? Because the left bank of Bordeaux is characterized by its devotion to Cabernet Sauvignon. There's a very strong, almost inarguable argument that the sort of the 2 miles up the motorway, up the road from Saint-Julien up to Pauillac represents the greatest terroir for Cabernet Sauvignon in the world. All, or so many of the greatest chateaus that you've heard of are within this pretty small section. And Cabernet Sauvignon loves gravel soils. It loves free draining soils. It's a grape which doesn't like getting its feet wet. Whereas over on the right bank, which we'll talk about more in a bit, and up here in the north of the Médoc in Saint-Estèphe, there's a little more clay in the soil, and clay is good for Merlot. You know, Merlot doesn't mind these more water retentive soils. So you tend to find a little more Merlot in the wines of Saint-Estèphe to balance out the Cabernet. And, you know, this is very much the case here with the Lafon Roche, which is about 54% Cabernet Sauvignon, 35% Merlot, according to my notes here, 6% Cabernet Franc, and 4% Petit Verdot, which is a pretty, you know, a pretty representative blend for a northern left bank Médoc wine. What makes Lafon Roche interesting is the particular type of clay that the vineyard enjoys. It's the hard blue clay that we find in key spots on the right bank of Bordeaux, particularly in Pomerol, particularly in the vineyards of Château Petrus. This hard blue clay is what makes Petrus Petrus. And it's quite interesting that, not to the same level, of course, but there's some nice pockets of this similar clay, of the same clay, in the vineyards of Lafon Roche. It was a relatively late starter, I suppose, for Bordeaux compared to some of the other chateaux in the 1660s. It was bought by the Tesseron family in the late 1950s. And to be honest, they've more or less done a complete overhaul. You know, from the vineyards, they replanted the Merlot, it was in the wrong soils. And the Cabernet, you know, they switched them around to where they should be. They've beautifully redone the chateau as well. It's now this kind of rather attractive cedro or lemon yellow color. And, you know, they've really pumped a huge amount of money into making Lafon Roche worthy of your attention. I mentioned Petrus earlier. They even employed Jean-Claude Berrouet, the consultant at Petrus, to come and make the wines here for a time as well. So, you know, there's little expense has been spared in getting the wine up to a certain standard. In terms of its position, its aspect, etc., we're down in the south of Saint-Estèphe. We are pretty close, you know, very near neighbors would be Cos d'Estornel, probably the most famous and most worthy of the Saint-Estèphe chateaux, alongside Montrose, and Ségur, which we'll sort of talk about in parenthesis in our next wine. And it's also very close to Lafite as well, who are up here in the north of Pauillac. So impressive terroir, impressive winemaking, impressive investment going into making the wines, you know, really pretty impressive. And last but not least, they, in this vintage, 2015, which we need to dwell a little bit on, they also redesigned and renovated the cellars, and they used the same very acclaimed and very expensive architect as Cheval Blanc, the gloriously named Christian de Ponzumac, sorry. And if you've ever been out to Cheval Blanc, you will know what an incredibly sort of space age and futuristic looking winery that is. So, you know, everything about what the family are doing here is geared up to ensuring the wines are as good as they possibly can be. 2015, I mean, 2015 is, I don't know, one could say, and I'm trying not to, well, no, one could say that 2015 is the first vintage of the modern era, maybe. You know, it's the new style of Bordeaux, and what a great vintage. Admittedly, I think it's a 5-star vintage on the right bank and various pockets of the left bank. I think by and large, there were a little bit more rain towards the harvest time in the northern Médoc, which probably meant that Saint-Estèphe wouldn't count it as quite as 5-star, maybe 4.5, who knows. But, you know, it's definitely a great vintage. And And this is far and away the youngest wine we'll drink. I know that the Carbonnieux was 2 years younger in real terms, but I think that was beginning to drink okay. Whereas, you know, this is the only infant of the tasting. Yeah, it's pretty sexy, isn't it? I mean, that kind of deep, dark, chocolatey nose. A lot of tobacco, a lot of black currant, blackberry, spiced plums, kind of compote fruit, cedar. Yeah, I mean, that's proper Bordeaux. It's proper Bordeaux. It's at the beginning of its drinking window, and I probably wouldn't open another bottle, you know, for another year or so. But I wouldn't be at all averse to someone else opening one of their bottles and asking me to drink it. So, you know, it's not a wine which refuses to give pleasure even now in its relative youth. Any thoughts or comments on Lafon Roche, Saint Estèphe, the vintage? Any questions? I'm saying that to give me time to actually enjoy the nose and taste myself.
I find it needs to open because it feels quite harsh on the tongue for me personally.
But the tannins are certainly still the structure is certainly pretty it's pretty present. It's still all there. And as I said, you know, this is the youngest wine in terms of its drinking window that we will drink this evening. If I'm honest, it would be glorious to be doing this tasting over a pretty rare steak right now, because I think that would mollify those tannins. You know, this is a wine which I would be comfortable seeing in a restaurant, on a restaurant list, ideally in a half bottle because it will have matured more quickly, and I would guzzle this with a decent bit of red meat with plenty, a nice kind of fatty vein around it would be really rather good. But it's certainly youthful, and as I said, there is no reason not to put the remaining bottles away. You know, I said the next one I'd open would be in 2 years. Realistically, I think this is a 5 to 10 year wine. 5 to 10 year wine. I poured quite a large glass for myself, so I'm gonna whilst you pour the next one, I'm gonna finish this. Maybe I should get another glass. No, I'm not gonna do that. But yeah, I do love this nose though. I have to say it's an impressive chateau. Price wise, good question. Perhaps Nathan or Luke or someone else could pop those in. I think that the 15 Lafon, as I recall, was somewhere in the region of 45, 50 pounds. That might have been in bond. I don't know if we've got any left, but it's sort of, you know, that's that sort of arena, maybe a touch less. But possibly Luke or Nathan, we could just pop the prices in as we go, would be most helpful. Good. So let's thanks, Nathan. Let's move on to the 2005 Phélan Ségur, which I'm super keen to try because I can't remember the last time I actually tried this wine, and it's becoming one of my favorites. Hopefully I'll be able to open it with a little more aplomb and ease than previously. Good. Yes. Right. Slightly more delicate tasting measure poured this time. Okay. Now we're talking. Now we're talking. When trying to put together a Bordeaux tasting, gosh, there's no shortage of options of what to do. And I think we've done things in 3 very specific pairs. You know, we've done White Bordeaux, 10 years difference, Northern Medoc, 10 years difference, and then we'll be coming on to Right Bank, same producer, 2 different vineyards, very different vineyards, but very comparable vintages. So, you know, there's any number of ways we could have taken this, but I think this is quite an interesting comparison, this particular pair that we're doing right now. Almost got a sense of deja vu about talking about the selection the last time we did a Bordeaux tasting. So very weird, just suddenly come back to me. But first thing to note, I normally don't spend much time talking about the color of wines, but it's worth just popping this towards your screen or onto something white, and you can definitely see that, you know, we're evolving properly now. You know, we're well away from anything kind of purple, not that perhaps we were even with the last red, but certainly this is very much into this sort of, you know, garnety rim, as one. Well, Luke, you've just done your diploma, you know, tasting, so you're probably having to use these sort of tedious descriptions. But you know, it's definitely, you know, it's definitely moving away from the primary fruit colors that we expect, and more into this developed hues, which is completely followed through on the nose as well. What a gorgeous nose this is! I mean, you know, whoa. Toffee, a lot of compote fruit, that sort of, you know, touch of prune, not too much though, still freshness, but definitely, you know, slightly more burnished fruit. Licorice anise from Raj, team Raj, absolutely. You know, there's yeah, it's for me that anise character though is a bit more subtle than licorice. It's more like, if you ever, you know, I love fennel. Fennel's one of my absolute favorites, and you know, when you chop up fennel, particularly the fennel tops, you get that slight, you know, that slight smell you're getting here. It's yeah, but it's gorgeous. I mean, it's proper Bordeaux. And 2005 is an incredible vintage. 2015 is an incredible vintage, but you know, 2015 has, if not its detractors, but people who are quite prepared to say it's great here, not so good here. These guys did well, these guys less so. 2005 is undoubtedly a 5-star vintage, and it's got years and years to go. It's really lovely trying this now, because, well, I mean, the 2005s that I have in my cellar, and sadly it's nowhere near as many as I would like, I won't be touching them for a number of years yet. It's the same as in Burgundy. 2005 was a glorious year. You know, the grapes were in such perfect condition when they were harvested that producers both in Burgundy and Bordeaux really felt that they could get, you know, the absolute most out of them that winemaking at the time allowed. And what that has led to is wines of incredible structure and intensity, but with quite marked tannins. And that means that they will age. In fact, they pretty much have to age. So a Cru Bourgeois like this, rather than a Cru Classé wine, you know, is probably the best level at which to start drinking any 05s you happen to have. 60% Cabernet Sauvignon, 40% Merlot. The estate became interesting when it was bought by Comte Nicolas Alexandre de Ségur, who was for a brief, glorious period, the sole owner of Bran Mouton, which became Mouton Rothschild, and Château Lafite, and Château Latour, and Calon Ségur. I mean, what an amazing opportunity that was. You know, that at one point, for a brief period, 3 of the first growths and Calon Ségur was owned by a single individual. I think there's a film in how he lost it all. Basically, I'd love to see that. That could be a great Netflix. Documentary would be too boring. It needs to be something kind of fun and French and ridiculous. But anyway, it was sold to the Delon family, so Jean Delon, who you might know from the ownership of Leo Velasquez, one of my absolute favorite wines. So the Delon family owned it right up until 2017, when it was sold to the chap who owns Sea Invest, one of the biggest international shipping companies, and it was sold for 90 million euros, which was at the time a record for a Cru Bourgeois sale. I think it still is. What's rather lovely, though, is that Veronique, the head winemaker, has remained as the winemaker, and Veronique joined us for our Bordeaux summit. I know a number of you were there with us in April. Veronique joined us as a commentator. She was certainly making interesting comments about the vintage. She's a wonderful woman, great winemaker. I think she is really carrying the estate forward in a good way. But before the, sorry, I got my timeline slightly, I leapt ahead of myself. Before the Delons, after the Delons rather, it was owned by the Jardinier brothers, wonderful brothers, who own Taillevin in Paris, the 3 Michelin-star restaurant, also Le Créaire in Champagne, and Taillevin 110 here in London, which is where I met them. And wonderful, charming, diffident, incredibly successful trio of brothers. And I think they sold the chateau because they wanted to concentrate on the hospitality side of their business. And certainly Le Créaire is fantastic, so do stay there. But what's wonderful, though, is that Veronique, their winemaker, has stayed on and is still doing great things. So much so that the 2019 Phélan Ségur was one of the absolute superstars of the En Primeur campaign this year. It got, I think it got quite extraordinarily high scores into the high 90s from not just James Suckling, but even slightly more reticent critics like Neil Martin, who just said this is the best wine they've ever made. So, Phélan Ségur is absolutely on the rise. It's totally one to look out for. And yeah, I mean, all credit to Veronique. She's doing great things and making tremendous wine. And this I think is proper claret. This is proper claret. Shall we turn our attention to the right bank? Yes, let's do that. Let's do that. I was debating a little bit earlier today before Charlie sent out the tasting sheet with the order of the wines, because I know Julia in particular loves the way that I like sort of changing the order around at the last minute in order to confuse everyone. And so I was genuinely wondering whether or not we would finish with the Dôme or start with the Dôme. Oh, sorry, start as in this final pair. But ultimately, I've decided we will do this in vintage order, as we have done with the previous 2 pairs. So we are going to start with the 2011 Le Dôme, please. That's such a good nose. Quick hands up here who hasn't been to a previous tasting either with Jonathan Maltus, either in real life or virtual, or with us talking about a Jonathan Maltus wine. Okay, there's definitely a hand there. There's a couple. Oh gosh, quite a few. God, a load. Oh my God, right. Far more than I'd anticipated. Right. Okay. Well, that's good because that allows me to wax a little more lyrical about our relationship with Jonathan. Firstly, I am sat on the bench just underneath the large oak tree in front of Chateau Tessier. Here we go. This is it, which has been Jonathan's home since about 1994. Jonathan's a very dear friend. He was in the petrochemical business, sold up, started making wine in Corbière, realized that wasn't the be-all and end-all of wine, moved up to Bordeaux, moved up to Saint-Emilion, bought this lovely Chateau Tessier, here we go, and was absolutely at the forefront of the early mid-90s garagiste movement, which saw the elevation of the right bank, absolutely, and largely due to the influence of Robert Parker, who, as Jonathan will gleefully say, was the first critic who started to taste the wines from these small producers, these small growers, who didn't come from illustrious backgrounds, who made a tiny amount of wine, who weren't trading on their aristocratic connections and history. And, you know, it was a glorious time for the right bank growers in Saint-Emilion Pomerol. Wines like Le Pin were born, Jean-Luc Tenevin, Valandro, and Jonathan. And, you know, Jonathan was very much at the vanguard of this right bank renaissance, you know, and was making exceptional, extraordinary wines. He's now got his OBE for wine, one of only, I think, 3 people to get an OBE for wine, along with Jancis Robinson and someone else who is better at pub quizzes will be able to tell me. But, you know, he's quite a character, Jonathan. He really is. He's very prevalent in our lives because he's responsible for our Ponte Labri wine, our single vineyard wine that we have with him, which forms the nexus of our club Ponte Labri. And he's also making our incredible kosher Bordeaux as well. So, you know, he's a very dear friend. He's an important person in our lives. Le Dôme, the wine we're drinking now, is the wine which shot him into prominence. So Chateau Tessier, again, one more time, behind me, is the biggest mark in Saint-Emilion. It's 40 hectares, a wonderful, wonderfully good value Saint-Emilion. You know, it's sort of, you know, knocks around the list at between 18 and 22 pounds a bottle. Very, very good indeed. But it's down on the plateau, where, sorry, I beg your pardon, it's down on the plain. Whereas, you know, the best wines of Saint-Emilion are up here on the côte and on the plateau of Saint-Emilion. And Le Dôme is a wonderful, glorious accident of a wine. So when Jonathan produced the first vintage in 96, when he bought it, he thought that he was buying 3.5 hectares of predominantly, if not exclusively, Merlot grapes. And it was only after the contract was signed that, you know, his enologist turned around and said, oh, Jonathan, by the way, you do realize this is 80% Cabernet Franc. You know, now, you know, at the time, and actually to this day, the now second biggest percentage of Cabernet Franc in any right bank wine is Chateau Cheval Blanc, which is about 60% Cabernet Franc, whereas Le Dôme, the wine we're drinking now, is 80% Cabernet Franc. And this has worked out remarkably well because as climate change becomes more and more insidious in its effects on wines in the southern regions of France, Cabernet Franc is a later ripener. It responds very well to the conditions that's thrown at it, and it makes great wines. So Jonathan's ended up with an incredible gem on his hands. And, you know, it's a back-to-back, well, no, it was a 99-point wine in 2009, a 100-point wine in 2010. and it's an absolute superstar. It's made in Burgundian style sizes, quantities rather. Unlike the left bank where we're talking about 120,000 bottles, Le Dôme is 5,000 or 6,000 bottles. And so when the left bank started to take on board some of the lessons of the right bank at the end of the 90s, early 2000s, Jonathan realized that it was important to evolve and adapt and move on and still be relevant. And he has a singular approach to winemaking in Bordeaux, whereas all the chateaus we've discussed thus far, if they have vineyards which aren't directly next to each other, or if they have more than one big vineyard, doesn't matter. They still lump them all together and call them Chateau ... Whereas Jonathan, his total vineyard holdings outside of Chateau Tessier down on the plain is probably not more than 12 hectares, something like that, 12, 13 hectares at most. And rather than rather than putting them all together, he does these single vineyards, these single vineyard expressions of Saint-Emilion, which is a much more Burgundian approach to Bordeaux. It's a uniquely Burgundian approach to Bordeaux. There's no one else doing this in Saint-Emilion or anywhere in Bordeaux. So everyone, get your noses in this if you haven't already. I haven't had a chance. I've been talking too much, but I mean, that's just gorgeous. There's no other word for it. It's just gorgeous. And 2011, I would say a bit of a hidden vintage in Bordeaux. It's 9 and 10 get all the plaudits, and deservedly so. They're great vintages. 11 went a little bit under the radar, but for me, this is a classic from Jonathan. This is a classic from any good producer, who are able to make compelling wines in vintages which are less well heralded. Because there's no denying this is a phenomenal wine. This is delicious. It's drinking brilliantly now. It will still comfortably see out another 15 years at least. There's loads of freshness, but it's just showing gorgeously. And, one of the reasons for this is that the care and attention in the vineyards is second to none. Jonathan now employs Thomas Duclos, probably the most exciting consultant enologist in Bordeaux. He used to work at Cheval Blanc. He now works with Chateau Canon and Razin Segler. And they have incredibly low yields here. I mean, really low yields. Not more than 4 bunches per vine. So it's a small vineyard, 3.5 hectares, with a small number of grapes coming off the vines. It's no wonder you get this incredible chocolatey, cassis-y, mockery concentration in the wine. This sort of gorgeous, intense blackberry pie, blackberry cobbler sort of nose. It's just gorgeous. And I see from the chat that it seems to be being quite well received, which is great and unsurprising. Right bank Bordeaux, as in the Merlot and Cabernet Franc based wines on the right bank, are definitely more supple, more hedonistic, more immediately enjoyable. They're possibly less cerebral. That's not saying I think you're all stupid, by the way. It's just they don't require you to have to sit back and kind of really tug on the beard to work out whether or not you enjoy these wines. They're just unashamedly gorgeous. They're just gorgeous wines. And it's a great pleasure to be given an opportunity to try Jonathan's wines, because they have what he likes to call sort of cashmere tannins, wonderfully rich, ripe fruit, lovely spice, great depth of flavor, lovely texture. They are hugely hugely enjoyable wines. So it's a great pleasure to sort of introduce his wines to you if you weren't already familiar with them. So we'll move on to the Merlot side of the vineyard, in fact, to finish off with the Vieux Château Mazerat. Fascinating nose, isn't it? Really, you've got oh gosh, at once a sort of deeper, prunier, sweeter nose, but I'm also getting a touch more floral character, more sort of violets, almost more kind of eucalypt, not quite mint, but eucalypt, I think. Dare I say it, a super Tuscan nose. Yeah. So Vieux Château Mazerat is the sort of other half of Le Dôme, as in when Jonathan was able to, he bought the other bit of the vineyard, which was in fact planted more to Merlot than Cabernet Franc. So this is about 65% Merlot, 35% Cabernet Franc. Unlike other Bordeaux producers who can kind of tinker with the blend each year, because as I mentioned, it tends to be large vineyards or blocks of vineyards, which are all kind of cobbled together. Jonathan's are very much site specific. So, you know, what is grown is what is made. And, you know, VCM, Vieux Château Mazerat, is a really gorgeous, very typical right bank Saint-Emilion blend. 2008 was the last great value Bordeaux vintage before things all went a bit crazy. You know, it was the vintage that was released just after the financial crisis, so prices were reasonable. It came on the back of 2007, which was a tricky vintage in Bordeaux, particularly for reds. I think the white that we had earlier showed that you could still make very interesting wines. But, you know, the Bordelais were on the back foot at the time. You know, they weren't charging like the Light Brigade as they have been in the last decade and a half, you know. So 2008, Bordeaux came out at quite a good price. And then Robert Parker picked up the vintage and sort of said, oh gosh, it's actually really rather good. And the prices then went up. And then the Chinese came into play, and this is a very important point to make, that, you know, after the financial crisis, which had a negative impact on prices, the rise of the interest in Bordeaux from Asia became very, very important for how Bordeaux was perceived and priced. And of course, you know, 8 being a very lucky number in China meant that this vintage, which was a good vintage without being, you know, an absolutely magnificent vintage, suddenly took on a price point which was extraordinary. And then that led to the subsequent elevation of the prices of 2009, which was unquestionably a better vintage, and 2010, which was as good, if not better still. So all of a sudden, Bordeaux went a bit crazy, and it was the Asian wine bubble of the late 2000s. Anyway, the point is that, you know, 2008 was quite a tricky vintage. You know, it was pretty cool. It was not a generous summer, as I think Jancis Robinson referred to as an ungenerous summer. You know, it wasn't giving you full ripeness. However, For those who were happy to wait a bit and pick later, the summer picked up. You had a, what we refer to as an Indian summer. It got sufficiently warm at the end to get nice ripe fruit. And the Vieux Château Mazerat 2008 was one of only two wines on the right bank, alongside Cheval Blanc, which is easily 10 times the price, if not more, which got 5 stars from Decanter from this particular vintage. So, it's absolutely the best. I think it's probably the best 08 Bordeaux that you will drink. And I think it's showing brilliantly now. Already in my glass, the sort of the compote fruit nose is still there, but I'm getting much higher toned elements. Sort of there's just like a whiff of black truffle, touch of like really aged balsamic vinegar, that kind of really sweet balsamic vinegar that we really love. A note of soy, even tamarind, a lot of kind of spices that I would use more regularly when I cook Chinese food if I was a better cook. But it definitely, yeah, there's a lot of interesting spice characters here, which makes it really attractive. Yeah, and a lovely vein of acidity down the middle there that keeps it fresh, almost all the way back to our second wine of the evening, the Clove Floridian 2007. Despite the age, despite the maturity, this sapidity, this sort of autolytic bitterness, this lovely kind of salty finish, which keeps the taste buds moving around, keeps the saliva glands going, makes you want to go and eat. These are refreshing wines. These are not heavy or dense wines. They've got great energy, and you either want another glass or something to go with it, or both, frankly. So, thoughts on any of these wines? I've been chuntering on as usual, but yeah, and I'm having a look through the chat, various bits and pieces, but let's have some challenging questions or comments, or come on, there must be some wines here you didn't like, or you like more than you thought you would, or I don't know, just what have we got? Glorious, smoother. I'm just reading the messages here until someone wants to someone wants to pipe up.
Tom, we had one of the Phélan wines. Why is so much Irish in Bordeaux?
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you, David. Well prepped. Your £5 note is winging its way over. Actually, the very simple answer is mutual hatred of the English. It really is. Whether it was the Scots or the Irish, traditionally the old alliance between the Scottish and the French was very, very strong, and there was a considerable diaspora of Irish emigres to Bordeaux in the 1800s. They were known as the, I'm going to get this wrong. It's so crazy. It was the flying swans. I'm going to say the flying swans. It might be the flying geese. Gosh, it's so terrible. I should know this, but it was one or the other. Anyway, but there was a large number of Irish emigres over to Bordeaux in the 1800s. Hence, you get wines like, it was Neil Phélan, I think, who was one of the latter founders of Fellaini Cigar. There is, of course, a wonderful and completely apocryphal story that Chateau O'Brien is a corruption of O'Brien. That sadly is not true, but there was definitely there's a book called The Year of the French, which I heartily recommend to lovers of historical fiction, which talked about a planned invasion of England, which was based on the French sending troops and ships to Ireland, and then sending them across. So the UK now benefits tremendously from its proximity to France, but back in the days, England as a political entity was constantly at war with the French. So, you know, my enemy's enemy is my friend meant that there were regular alliances between Ireland, between Scotland, and France, which is why, you know, in many respects the influence of Ireland and Scotland is more in France, in Bordeaux, with regards to the establishment of these chateaux than the English. Look at Leoville Barton. You know, the Barton family are resolutely Irish, and, you know, are probably one of the most powerful forces in Bordeaux today.
Yeah, because it was the wild geese, by the way, that were
Wild
the
geese.
immigrant
There you go.
workers.
Yeah.
But there's also apocryphal stories that obviously at one point we used Irish mercenaries during our long campaign against the French, and that one particular mercenary did manage to leave more than his military presence behind, and was offered a vineyard if he married the daughter so that she didn't have a bastard.
Excellent. Now, David, can you enlighten us as to which particular chateau this was?
If I'd paid more attention when I was drinking with the Irish in Bordeaux, I would remember which chateau they were talking about. But
I think it might be.
I did have a little wine that evening.
Yeah, it might be Chateau Clark. If not, let's say it is for now until we're disproven. But definitely, yeah. No, it's certainly true that when you look at the toings and froings of the relationship between the British Isles and France, you know, there were periods where the Scots were shipping whiskey across to France and receiving, you know, barrels of claret in return. The entire genesis of the port industry sprung up because the insatiably alcoholic Brits needed something else to drink when we were at continual war with France. And of course, you know, Portugal was a great trading empire and a great trading ally, and it was easy for us to get booze from, you know, when we were embargoed from getting wines from France. So definitely the history of our alcoholic consumption is largely based, in the past at least, on the political alliances that we had at various stages. Luckily, right now, of course, we're about to cut them all off and become our own gloriously independent island. And thank God, 2018 was a brilliant vintage. So we've got the first decent English reds, because that could well be all we have to drink for the next 20 years. But you know, anyway, sorry, that was a little political, but wine is tied up with politics. There's no denying it.
Well, absolutely. Chateau Talbot, one of my great favourites, was actually from, I think, the Earl of Shrewsbury, who was called Talbot at the time, happened to be the governor of Aquitaine, which is how he laid his hands on the property.
Yeah, and let's not forget that, you know, the Battle of Castillon, when finally the English seceded their remaining, you know, territories in France back to the French, was, I mean, it was only 700 years ago. It was practically yesterday. So you know, there are plenty of people who think that, you know, Bordeaux is basically English. There are certainly more pinstripes. More I can guarantee there's more Savile Row tailoring in Bordeaux than there is, you know, French tailoring. So it's pretty much British. It's pretty much British, frankly.
Well, it's amazing the impact we've had on the wine trade, because the period you're alluding to, when we had to fortify Portuguese wine to make it drinkable, having brought it over and found it undrinkable, is equally when the German wine industry got a massive boost, because we brought in barrels of hock, because we could get those through the barricades. And there's a very amusing letter in the Admiralty really making a protest by the government of the day that when we ordered you to blockade the ports of France, we meant it to stop stuff coming out except the wine.
Yeah, I love it. It's a great dispensation. I really hope that Brexit will accord us the same decency. In fact, the very fact that the government have insisted on a 6-month stay of the requirements that we will probably find ourselves facing with regards to the legislature around imports shows that there is no great willingness to impede the transfer of fine wine from France into the UK or elsewhere for that matter.
Well, I think, isn't it Edinburgh that is still the largest purchaser in the trade numbers of fine claret, mainly because of the difference in the taxation systems between France and the UK on wine?
Wow! If that is the case, then my friends in Edinburgh are keeping it very quiet. I certainly haven't been invited to as many fine wine dinners at my old alma mater, university there, as I have elsewhere. So I'll look into that, David, because I can neither deny it nor confirm it. But it's definitely.
Well, I don't think they ever take delivery of the wine, but I believe that in the trade numbers that are published by the UK and France, that Scotland is the largest purchaser of Bordeaux wine, I think, in the world, because so much of it is just shoved through there to take advantage of the tax systems.
Wow. Well, there you go. That's my homework for, if not later tonight, but tomorrow. I will have to see if that's true. Anyway, team, any more comments or questions or things that we need to cover this evening before we disappear off for our dinners? Possibly not. I can never tell if people are leaning forward to put their glasses down or to unmute themselves. Graham, you've just unmuted yourself.
God, Tom, at Château Tessier, there's a new Norman Foster design building, isn't there, that's going in there? His Michelin-star restaurant, fabulous estate from the visit that you organised, not last year, the year before. We did Italy last year, and the year before was Bordeaux, but it's definitely worth a visit, from what I would strongly suggest.
Thank you, Graham. Absolutely, and you're absolutely correct. Right now, the finishing touches are being put on the new winery that Jonathan is building under the watchful eye of Lord Norman Foster, who personally designed it and has taken a personal interest in the winery. And it's right by the Dôme Mazerat and Château Mazerat vineyard, not far from our own Ponte Labri. It's just in front of Angelus and also Beauchazeux, Becco, and Defro-Lagaros. And it will be opening, we think, at the end of this year or early. No, I beg your pardon. No, it'll be in 2021. And it will be a pretty sensational place to go visit. And we intend to do that with our Club Ponte Labri members, of course, of whom you number, Graham. So yeah, this is our sort of well, for anyone who's interested in more information on Club Ponte Labri, we'll certainly send it. But it's rather a fun echelon of the Honest Grapes sort of setup. And yeah, it's quite remarkable that Norman Foster, whose last project in Bordeaux was redesigning Chateau Margaux to the tune of 100 million, has personally got involved with Jonathan to design his new winery. And it's very exciting that he'll be there for the launch. There's a couple of special guests yet to be confirmed, but Jonathan's very confident that it'll either be Prince William or Mick Jagger or both to cut the ribbon. And if you'd like to join us on this journey, then we can send you more details about Ponte Labri and on. So thank you, Graham. Thank you for raising that, because it's going to be very, very exciting. Good. Well, team, it's been an absolute pleasure to see you all. Thank you. Please do join us for our fortified tasting next week, I think. And if not then some other tasting, virtual or IRL, as we now have to call it, in the very near future. Thank you very much. Cheers, team.